The morning sun slid over the Bitterroot Range like a slow exhale, catching on the fence lines of an old Montana ranch that hadn't seen real visitors in years. Inside the faded barn, a man in his late 60s was oiling the hinges on a feed room door, humming something low and unhurried. The man was Frank Dalton, once a name printed on circus posters from Ohio to Texas, now just another rancher with more memories than cattle. He moved with a steady limp, the kind that came from time and hard lessons, not accidents. Every motion was deliberate, as if he were careful not to wake something he'd long tried to put to rest. The ranch looked quiet, but it wasn't empty. 2 rescue horses grazed near the pond, a handful of chickens scratched by the porch, and in the corner of the barn hung a dusty rope whip. Frank hadn't touched it in 30 years. Sometimes, when the wind rushed through the eaves, it sounded like a ghost, reminding him where he came from. Years ago, he'd been the man who made animals dance under lights. He'd worked for a traveling circus, a half-legal outfit that crisscrossed the South with lions, wolves, even a bear, once one he still dreamed about. That bear had been gentle, almost human in the eyes, but beaten down by noise and chains. Frank had been young, proud, convinced that applause meant kindness. He'd told himself the shows gave people joy, that the animals were fine. Then one humid night in Oklahoma, a tiger slipped her collar backstage. He still remembered the sound, the whip crack, the shouts, the cage door slamming too late. Frank ran toward the noise and saw it another handler panicking, striking the tiger to drive her back. The animal lunged, cornered, terrified, more trapped by human fear than by any cage. When the chaos cleared, the tiger lay breathing, shallow eyes fixed on Frank as if accusing him of all the nights she'd been chained. That look followed him long after he left the circus grounds. He never returned. That was the night Frank walked away. No farewell, no explanation, just a long drive north, trading the neon of the Midway for the quiet of pine trees. He found this piece of land by accident, bought it cheaply, and stayed. For decades, he kept his distance from wildlife, convinced he didn't deserve their trust. The circus had paid his bills, but it had broken something sacred inside him, the simple belief that animals existed for themselves, not for show. In the years that followed, Frank lived small. He raised horses, fixed fences, and volunteered when wildfires swept through the valley. People said he was a good man, but few knew what he carried. Sometimes he'd find himself standing at the edge of the forest at dusk, watching deer slip between the trees, their movements free, untrained, utterly indifferent to him. And that he realized was grace. He began to keep a habit, a quiet kind of ritual. Each dawn before coffee, he read a single verse from the old leather Bible his mother left him. That morning, the verse was from Proverbs. "The righteous care for the needs of their animals, but the kindest acts of the wicked are cruel." Frank closed the book slowly, the weight of it steady in his palm. He didn't quote scripture often, but that line stayed with him. He figured it was less about religion and more about responsibility. There was a rhythm to his days. Fix a gate, feed the horses, patch the roof before the snow. In the evenings, he'd sit on the porch sipping black coffee, listening to coyotes calling somewhere beyond the ridge. He could tell the difference between a coyote's cry and a bear's distant groan, old instincts he hadn't forgotten. In summer, he'd sometimes see grizzly tracks down near the creek, small ones too, a reminder that somewhere nearby a mother bear was teaching her cubs the same lessons he once failed to teach his own kind, how to live without cruelty. Frank wasn't proud of what he'd done, but he didn't run from it either. Redemption, he figured, didn't mean pretending the past never happened. It meant doing something different next time. He often thought about the circus cages, the smell of sawdust and sweat, the way animals looked at you when they realized the tricks weren't games but orders. That knowledge never stopped burning. The townsfolk liked him. They called him Old Dalton and asked him for advice on fence repair or feed mix. Kids brought him injured birds, raccoons, and once even a fawn tangled in wire. He helped every one of them. Word spread that he had a way with wild things. He never called it that, but he didn't deny it either. He just knew how to be still around fear. Sometimes he'd laugh softly when he thought about it, how the man who once locked cages now built them for healing. He had converted an old horse pen into a temporary holding enclosure for rescued forest animals, a kind of personal wildlife sanctuary. Nothing fancy, No big funding, no signs, just a few sturdy fences and a promise that no animal under his care would perform again. Then, one early winter evening, he received a call. The phone rang just as the first snow started to fall, the kind of slow, heavy flakes that silence everything. He hesitated before answering. Most people didn't call this late. On the other end was a man's voice, familiar but shaky. "Frank," it said. "It's Miguel. From the old days." Frank's stomach tightened. He hadn't heard that name in decades. Miguel had been the circus mechanic, the one who fixed cages and trucks, the one who'd covered for Frank the night he left. "You still out in Montana?" Miguel asked. "Yeah," Frank said cautiously. "They've got animals again," Miguel whispered. "Not the big show, something worse. Backroad stuff. Illegal. You wouldn't believe what they're doing. I tried to stop it. They're dying, Frank. 2 bear cubs." "Cubs?" Frank froze. The word hit him like thunder. Miguel continued, voice breaking. "I left a note there. Can't stay. Too dangerous, but maybe you can help." Then the line went dead. Frank stood in silence, the phone pressed to his chest. Outside, the snow thickened, covering the ground like ash. He looked toward the barn, toward the whip that still hung from its hook. He thought of the tiger's eyes, the ones that never left him, and of all the caged creatures who never got a second chance. He put on his coat and hat, grabbed his truck keys, and paused only long enough to whisper, "If there's a way to make this right, Lord, show me." The wind rose as he drove into the night, headlights slicing through the storm. His old pickup rattled down the highway heater, barely working wipers, smearing more than clearing. The road twisted past frozen fields, old barns, and miles of pine forest. Frank's breath fogged the windshield as he repeated Miguel's words. 2 bear cubs. Dying. For the first time in years, he felt purpose thrum beneath his ribs, not pride, not excitement, just a simple pull towards something that mattered. He'd walked away from the circus once to escape his guilt. Now he was driving straight toward it again, this time with a different reason. And under that storm-dark sky, as the truck climbed the mountain pass, a verse came back to him unbidden. The righteous care for the needs of their animals. He murmured it once quietly and pressed harder on the gas. That was how Frank Dalton retired, rancher, quiet neighbor man, who swore never to set foot near another circus, found himself returning to the world he'd abandoned. Not for applause, not for forgiveness, but for 2 creatures who hadn't yet learned what humans could do to them. He didn't know then that those cubs would change everything, the rhythm of his days, the shape of his faith, even the way he saw his own reflection. He only knew that the storm ahead was thick, and somewhere beyond it, 2 small lives waited for him to decide whether he'd finally do what he hadn't done before. Stay and fight for them. The truck disappeared into the snow taillights, blinking like distant beacons, and behind him, the ranch fell silent again. But something new had started moving, like the low rumble of thunder far off in the mountains. It was the sound of old debts, waking of grace, coming back around. That night, as the storm deepened and the last stretch of road vanished under white, Frank saw the faint glow of a tent on the horizon. The same kind of tent he'd once called home. Only this time he wasn't going to perform inside it, he was going to tear it apart. Frank drove through the storm as if memory itself was chasing him. The wipers thumped a steady rhythm and the headlights carved narrow tunnels of light through sheets of rain. He hadn't thought about the circus in years, but Miguel's voice kept replaying in his mind. 2 bear cubs. Dying. The words had weight, not urgency alone, but accusation, like they'd been waiting all this time for him to do something right. He followed the directions Miguel texted before the call dropped a dirt road off Highway 93 somewhere between Stevensville and an old rail yard. The closer he got, the more the world around him turned ghostly. Faded trailers, collapsed signs, torn posters plastered to fences with faces of animals painted smiling. He slowed the truck and killed the headlights. The circus grounds were smaller than he expected, more like a graveyard of bad ideas. A tent sagged in the middle half, collapsed under rainwater. Generators silent. Not a sound except the steady drumming on canvas and the wind twisting loose flaps of fabric like tired flags. Frank grabbed his flashlight and stepped out. The mud pulled at his boots, cold and slick. The beam caught something nailed to a post near the entrance, an envelope sealed with tape, the paper soaked but still legible. Frank, it read. Inside a short note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Couldn't wait. Too dangerous. They're in the back. Save them if you can. M. His breath fogged in the beam of light. He tucked the note into his pocket and pushed inside the tent. The air was heavy with a smell he knew too well, rust mold and fear. Animal musk that didn't belong in this kind of silence. His flashlight cut through rows of broken cages, rusted bars, torn ropes, a few discarded feed buckets. And then faintly, a sound something between a whimper and a growl. He followed it to the far corner where two small cages sat under a tarp. He lifted it. Inside the first cage, a bear cub barely the size of a medium dog stared back at him. Its fur was matted with mud, and dried blood eyes, wide amber, bright even through exhaustion. The second cage held another cub, smaller, barely moving. A breath here, a twitch there. Frank knelt, hands trembling. "Hey, now," he whispered, voice breaking the stillness. "You don't need to be afraid anymore." The first cub hissed weakly, pressing itself against the back wall. The second didn't move. Frank reached through the bars, feeling the cold air on his skin. He remembered how it used to be, the handlers, shouting animals, flinching lights, flashing. The smallest ones always suffered most. He'd told himself back then it was training, not torment. Tonight, the lie burned away for good. He searched for tools. In a corner lay a rusted crowbar. With one hard pull, the first lock gave. The cub jolted, eyes wide, but didn't strike. The second lock took longer, the metal squealing before it snapped. Frank wrapped the weaker cub in his jacket. It was shockingly light. The other one stayed pressed to the corner, wary. "Come on," he murmured. "You too." He didn't rush it, just crouched there, holding the first cub close until the second one sniffed the air and crept forward, step by step. Rainwater dripped from the tent roof. When it came close enough, Frank eased the cub into a canvas feed sack, soft, warm, dark. The animal didn't fight. That scared him more than teeth would have. He carried both toward the exit, one in his arms, one tucked close to his chest. The storm outside had turned violent. Sheets of rain blurred everything into motion. He slipped twice on the mud, but never loosened his grip. The headlights of his truck glowed faintly through the storm. He opened the passenger door, laid both cubs on a wool blanket, and turned the heat up as high as it would go. For a long moment, he just stood there in the rain, heart pounding, unsure what came next. He was an old man with no permit, 2 wild cubs, and a promise to a ghost. But as he looked at them, tiny, broken, alive, he felt something he hadn't in decades: conviction. When he climbed into the driver's seat, the smaller cub stirred. It made a faint noise, almost like a sigh. Frank started the truck and pulled back onto the road. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "Both of you." The drive home took an hour. He checked the mirror every few seconds to make sure they were still breathing. The heater barely worked, but his coat covered them, trapping the warmth. At one point, the first cub, the stronger one, lifted its head and met his eyes in the reflection. A wild gaze. Not grateful, not gentle, just alive. That look reminded him of something Dr. Laura Keene once told him when she treated one of his rescue horses. "Wildlife doesn't owe you trust. They owe you nothing at all. You earn it every day or you don't get it." By the time he reached the ranch, dawn was stretching gray light across the valley. He parked by the barn, carried the cubs inside, and laid them near the stove. The smell of wet fur filled the room. He wrapped them in blankets, then picked up the phone. It rang 5 times before she answered. "Laura." "It's Frank. I need you to come right now. What happened?" Her voice sharpened. 2 bear cubs. Found them in an illegal setup off 93. They're hurt badly." He heard her exhale sharply. "You didn't... Frank, you didn't take them yourself, did you?" "I did," he said simply. "No time to call anyone else." "All right. Don't feed them anything yet. Keep them warm. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up and knelt by the cubs. The weaker one's breathing was shallow, rattled. Frank rubbed its back gently, trying to stimulate warmth. The other watched him from half-lidded eyes, muscles tense but too tired to resist. He kept whispering to them, nonsense words, small comforts. When Dr. Keene arrived, she didn't waste time. She moved like someone who'd seen too many rescues come too late. "They're grizzlies," she said, crouching beside them. "Montana natives, probably caught from the wild last spring." She examined their paws, teeth, and IBS. Severe dehydration, malnourished. The smaller one may be internal bruising. "You did right bringing them in." Frank nodded, though his chest tightened at the sight of their condition. "They'll make it?" "Too early to say," Laura replied. "But they've got a chance." She gave him a look, half warning, half understanding. "You know you're not supposed to keep them." "I know," he said, "but if I hadn't taken them, they'd already be dead." Laura sighed, then smiled faintly. "You always had that stubborn streak." They worked for hours. Fluids, antibiotics, careful feeding through syringes. The smaller cub barely swallowed, but its chest kept rising. Laura eventually sat back, wiping her hands. "They need rest. So do you." Frank shook his head. "I'll stay." Laura studied him. "You ever think maybe you were meant for this? Not the circus, not the shows. Just this quiet, hard, thankless work that no one sees." He didn't answer right away. The fire crackled. The stronger cub shifted closer to its sibling. "Maybe," he said finally. "Or maybe I'm just trying to even the score." Laura smiled softly. "Same thing if you ask me." When she left, the cabin fell quiet except for the soft, rhythmic breathing of the cubs. Frank poured himself a cup of coffee, but it went cold before he drank it. His eyes kept drifting to the blanket. In that stillness, a simple realization took hold, something he'd never quite allowed before. Redemption didn't come through grand gestures or applause. It showed up in small, trembling bodies that needed warmth, and in the choice to stay when it was easier to walk away. He didn't name them that night, though he caught himself thinking in words again. Maple and rust, he would decide later, for the color of the dawn and the iron earth they'd survive on. He leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight, and watched the fire throw soft orange light over the cubs. The stronger one blinked at him, then pressed its paw against the smaller's flank, a clumsy protective gesture that made Frank smile for the first time that day. Outside, the storm had eased. The air smelled of wet pine and distant smoke. Somewhere in the forest, coyotes called, and for a moment it felt like the whole valley was holding its breath, waiting to see whether these tiny survivors would make it through the night. It wasn't about saving, it was about staying. About bearing witness when life hung by a thread and refusing to look away. Frank reached for his Bible on the mantel, thumbed it open without looking. The page fell on the same verse as before, the righteous care for the needs of their animals. He smiled faintly. "All right, Lord," he murmured. "I'm listening." As dawn crept higher, the smaller cub stirred a weak sound, barely more than breath. Frank bent close, eyes wide, hope flickering like the fire beside them. That was when Laura's words echoed back to him. "Too early to say, but they've got a chance." He didn't yet know that the hardest night was still ahead. By evening, the wind outside had settled into a steady sigh through the pines. The storm had passed, but the weight of it lingered in Frank's bones. He'd spent the whole day tending the cubs, warming bottles of goat's milk, checking the small ones' breathing every hour. Dr. Keene had left just before sunset, her voice firm but gentle. "Keep them close to the heat. If the little one makes it through tonight, it'll make it through the week." Frank didn't like the sound of "if." He'd heard it before on farms and barns in the circus. It was the word people used when they didn't want to say goodbye. The larger cub, the one he'd started calling Maple, had eaten twice weekly but willingly. The smaller one, Rust, hadn't touched a thing. Its body barely moved under the blanket breath, shallow ribs showing with every slow rise. Frank sat beside the stove, coat still on, coffee untouched. Outside, the sky was an ink-black sheet stars hidden. He listened to the fire crackle and the faint sounds of wildlife beyond the ranch. The coyotes, the owls. a distant elk's call echoing through the valley. Life went on, as it always did. But inside the cabin, everything hung on a single heartbeat. He touched Rust's nose cold. The cub's eyes fluttered, then stilled. Panic rose fast and sharp. He'd seen animals die before, but not like this. Not something that looked at him with the trust of a creature that hadn't yet learned to fear him. "Come on, little one," he muttered, rubbing its chest gentle circles, the way he'd seen vets do. "You're not done yet." No response, only silence and Maple's quiet breathing beside it. Frank moved the smaller cub closer to the fire, rubbed its fur. Harder, whispered words that barely had sound. "You're stronger than you look. I know it." It was a strange thing talking to a bear cub as if it could hear him. Yet, in that moment, he wasn't rescuing wildlife. He was pleading with something far deeper, the part of himself that once gave up too easily. He grabbed his phone thumb, hovering over Laura's number. Then he stopped. He already knew what she would say. There's nothing more to do. Fluids were in body temperature dropping. Only time and will could finish the fight now. Frank looked at the small shape wrapped in his jacket and whispered, "Then we wait." He shifted his chair closer to the fire, pulled the cub into his lap and held it there. The animal was limp, a handful of fragile weight. He remembered another night long ago when a circus lion had gone cold in his arms after a long trip without water. He had walked away, then left the cage door half open, hoping that was mercy. Tonight, he wouldn't walk anywhere. Hours passed. The fire sank low. The ranch fell silent. Frank felt the old ache in his knees, the stiffness in his hands. He fought the urge to pray out loud. He'd never been one for big words, but his lips moved anyway. "If there's still breath in this one, don't take it from me yet. Not tonight." He didn't realize he was crying until the tears hit his sleeve. The cub's fur was damp from both their breath. He kept rubbing slow and steady, whispering nonsense stories of open fields, mountain rivers, places bears belonged. He told them about the sanctuary he'd once dreamed of building but never dared to start. "Maybe this is where it begins," he murmured. "Maybe it starts with you." Somewhere in that long silence, the cub twitched. Just once. Frank froze, holding his breath. Then again, a weak gasp, a sound more felt than heard. The body shuddered, tiny lungs pulling against the weight of exhaustion. Frank closed his eyes, jaw trembling. "That's it. That's the fight I was waiting for." He laid Rust back beside Maple, tucked both under his old quilt, and stoked the fire higher. The cabin glowed with a soft golden warmth. He kept watch through the night. Every small movement amplified the shift of pause, the rise and fall of breath. When the first gray light bled through the window, Rust's breathing had steadied. Maple was awake, nosing at its sibling as if checking too. Frank leaned back in his chair, exhaustion catching up. He hadn't slept in 20 hours, but a peace settled over him, not triumph, just quiet relief. He thought about what Laura had said that morning. "You ever think maybe you were meant for this?" He hadn't known how to answer then. Now, watching those cubs sleep, he thought maybe he did. Wildlife rescue wasn't about heroics or grandeur. It was about moments like this, silent, uncertain, almost invisible. The kind of work no one clapped for. He realized that night how different compassion felt when it asked for patience instead of praise. It wasn't a feeling, it was endurance. As the sun rose, he took a notebook from the shelf and wrote down everything that had happened, feeding time's fluids. Temperature, behavior. He'd learned from Laura that wildlife rehabilitation required records, not just instinct. You keep track of every detail, she'd told him once, because their lives depend on patterns you might not notice otherwise. He smiled at the memory. The old circus man is learning science. Maybe redemption looked like that too. Slow learning, one observation at a time. Maple stirred, crawled weakly onto Rust's blanket and pressed close. The sight stopped him cold. Two small creatures, one recovering, one resting, each leaning into the other without knowing why. He thought of something his mother used to say when he was a boy. Sometimes the hurt heal each other faster than any doctor can. He hadn't understood it then. Now he did. He stepped outside to breathe. The valley was quiet, washed clean by the night's storm. The forest shimmered with early frost. Steam rose from the barn roof. He could smell pine-wet soil and something else possibility. The kind of morning that made a man believe things could grow again even after long winters. He stood there for a while, feeling the cold bite at his hands, thinking of how many years he'd spent avoiding this kind of responsibility. He'd always told himself he didn't want to get attached, didn't want to lose again. But maybe loss was the cost of real care. Maybe the people who avoided it the most were the ones who needed to feel it again to remember they were alive. When he went back inside, the cubs were both awake. Maple was pawing weakly at the edge of the blanket. Rust lifted its head, blinking as if the light hurt its eyes. Frank crouched low. "Welcome back, little fighter," he said softly. The cub blinked, then gave a small sound, not quite a growl, more like the noise a child makes when waking from a bad dream. It was the most beautiful sound Frank had ever heard. He fed them both with a syringe, tiny sips, patient, methodical. Maple drank first, then nudged the tip toward Rust, who hesitated, then followed. Frank laughed quietly, surprised at himself. "Look at that, you're teaching each other already." It was ridiculous talking like that, but in the quiet cabin with no one around to hear it, felt right. Later, as he cleaned up, he noticed how the morning light hit the wall where his mother's Bible hung open on its small shelf. The same verse from the night before caught his eye again. The righteous care for the needs of their animals. He'd read those words for years, but this time they felt different, alive, specific. They weren't about morality. They were about devotion, about the kind of loyalty that doesn't check the clock. By noon, Laura called. "How are they?" she asked. Frank hesitated, then smiled. "Alive," he said. "Both of them." She paused, then let out a small breath. "That's good, Frank. That's really good." He heard papers rustling on her end of the line. "I'll stop by tomorrow. We'll check their hydration, get them onto a solid formula." But she softened her voice. "Don't think you can keep them forever. The state will want to know." "I know," he said, looking at the cubs sleeping near the fire. "I just need them to know the world isn't all cages before they leave it." Laura didn't reply right away. Then quietly, "That's not just for them, is it?" Frank chuckled, a rough sound that wasn't quite laughter. Maybe not. He hung up and looked around the small cabin. The air felt lighter. He realized he hadn't thought about the circus all morning. Not the cages, not the noise, not the guilt. Just this feeding, breathing, listening, the present tense of redemption. That night when darkness fell again, the fire crackled warmly. Maple rolled over, snoring softly. Rust curled near its side, breathing steady and sure. Frank watched them for a long time before turning out the lamp. For once, sleep came easily. He dreamed not of cages or crowds, but of open forests, tall grass rivers cutting through stone. He dreamed of two bear cubs running free, their small footprints pressed into mud beside his own. When he woke before dawn, he realized something had changed, not in them, but in him. The night of crisis had stripped away everything that wasn't necessary. All that remained was care, the kind that didn't need permission or audience. He'd thought saving animals was about courage. Maybe it was about surrender. As the next day broke, Frank opened the door and watched mist drift across the valley. Maple climbed clumsily onto a log near the window, testing strength. Rust followed slower, but determined. Their eyes caught the light. Frank smiled. "Looks like we're all learning how to stand again." He didn't yet know that healing wasn't a finish line, it was a season. And theirs was only beginning. Winter ended the way it often did in Montana, without ceremony. The snow didn't melt so much as retreat, leaving behind dark patches of earth like scars under thawing ice. Inside the ranch cabin, two bear cubs were learning how to live again. Maple's limp had faded. Rust's appetite had returned. They were still small for their age, but the dullness had lifted from their eyes. Frank had spent the first months building a rhythm around them. Dawn meant warming milk and checking temperatures. Afternoons meant cleaning their enclosure, watching from the porch as they explored the yard. Nights meant quiet firelight and the soft breathing of two lives that somehow trusted him more each day. He'd given them room to grow a fenced pen with logs to climb water for splashing and a thick layer of straw where they could wrestle and sleep. It wasn't the wild, but it was better than cages. When Maple clambered up the stump and toppled into rust, Frank would laugh half in surprise, half in disbelief at how fast they'd changed. Dr. Keene visited weekly through the spring. She checked their coats, adjusted their diet, and showed Frank how to introduce new foods. Berries, trout, bits of venison. They need to know what real food tastes like, she said. Wildlife rescue is about reteaching instincts, not replacing them. Frank nodded, taking notes in his small spiral pad. Every entry began with the same words, both cubs fed, both strong. He'd started writing not just for their sake, but for his own. It made him notice things: how Maple always ate first but left a share, how Rust hesitated before every new sound, how both would freeze when an owl called from the forest. They were teaching him patience, one heartbeat at a time. One morning in April, Frank was mending a gate when he heard a quiet voice behind him. "You're the guy with the bears, right?" He turned. A boy stood by the fence, tall, thin backpack slung over one shoulder, camera in hand. "Name's Mason," he said. "I live up the road. My granddad said you might let me take pictures if I asked nicely." Frank hesitated, then smiled. "Depends on how nice you can ask." The boy grinned. "Pretty nice." That was how it started. Mason came every few days after school, sitting by the fence with his camera, sketching or snapping photos while the cubs played. He didn't make noise or move fast. He just watched. Frank noticed how the cubs didn't fear him. They were curious. It was strange seeing a new generation look at wildlife with fascination instead of ownership. One afternoon, Mason showed Frank a photo he'd printed. Maple mid-leap, front paws outstretched, Rust behind her like a shadow. "You see this?" Mason said, excited. "Looks like she's laughing." Frank chuckled. "Bears don't laugh." "Maybe not like us," the boy said, "but look at her eyes. She's happy." That night, Frank sat on the porch, watching the cubs chase each other in the fading light. He thought about what Mason said. Maybe happiness wasn't just noise or motion. Maybe it was trust. The bears weren't performing. They were just being. As the seasons turned, the cubs changed with them. Spring gave them curiosity. Summer gave them strength. Maple grew bold, climbing higher, splashing harder. Rust stayed deliberate, thoughtful, always a step behind, always watching her first. They were opposites that worked a balance of caution and courage. Frank noticed how their play had purpose. Every tumble was practice for survival, reflexes sharpening, instincts reawakening. When one rolled too close to the fence, the other would tug it back as if some old memory whispered, "Stay together." Wildlife. Frank realized healed in patterns. It wasn't about time, it was about repetition. Feed, rest, explore, repeat. Each cycle built confidence. The same was true for people. He hadn't thought much about his own healing until then. The circus felt distant now, almost like someone else's story. Every time Maple's claws hit bark or Rust's growl deepened, it rewrote a piece of his past. Dr. Keene noticed it too. "You're different," she said one afternoon, scribbling notes on her clipboard. Frank shrugged. "Just less tired, I guess." She smiled knowingly. That's what purpose does. By midsummer, the cubs were nearly as tall as Frank's waist. Their coats gleamed with gold and cinnamon tones. Mason brought over a motion camera he'd borrowed from a friend. They set it up near the fence to capture nighttime behavior. "You'll want to see how they act when you're not around," he told Frank. The footage revealed what they'd suspected after dark. The cubs became explorers. They dug, wrestled, splashed in the pond, and sometimes just stared at the stars side by side. Watching the clips, Frank felt a mix of pride and melancholy. He knew what it meant. They were getting ready for something bigger. One evening in August, Mason sat on the porch steps flipping through his photos. "What'll happen to them when they're grown?" he asked quietly. Frank exhaled. "When they're strong enough, they'll have to go back. That's the law." Mason frowned, but they wouldn't survive out there alone. "They'll have to," Frank said. "That's what wild means." The boy nodded slowly. "Still seems unfair. They didn't ask for any of this." Frank thought for a long time before replying. "Most of life's unfair, but maybe that's why we're here to tip the balance a little. Just enough to give them a chance." Mason didn't answer, but Frank saw the way he looked at the cubs after that with more reverence, less pity. As the year turned autumn painted the valley in gold, Maple and Rust were nearly full-sized. Their play had turned into sparring, quick, deliberate, fierce, but never cruel. Frank began to spend more time observing than helping. He'd toss apples into the pen, then stand back and watch them split them open with precise claws. They were learning what they were born for. Sometimes, when the sun hit just right, he could see his reflection in the window, an old man beside two young bears. It struck him that healing wasn't about erasing scars. It was about learning to live with them visible but no longer aching. He'd see flashes of his old life in their movements, the confidence of performers, the rhythm of the ring, but this time it belonged to them. No ropes, no cues, no lights. Just instinct. That fall, Dr. Keene brought good news. "They're healthy," she said. "Stronger than I hoped. You did it." Frank smiled, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like goodbye coming closer. Mason sensed it too. "You're really letting them go?" Frank nodded. "That's the plan. You think they'll remember you?" "Doesn't matter if they do," Frank said. "What matters is they remember themselves." The boy looked away, blinking fast. "Can I come when it happens?" Frank hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, you can come." They spent the next few weeks preparing. Frank reduced contact following Laura's instructions, feeding from a distance, letting the cubs spend nights without his voice. It was harder than he expected. Every instinct screamed to protect, but this time protection meant absence. Each morning he'd find their paw prints in the mud wider, surer. He traced them with his hand, memorizing the size, the spread. Soon they'd leave tracks somewhere he couldn't follow. The day before release, Mason caught one last picture, Maple and Rust sitting side by side facing the trees beyond the fence. "Looks like they're already saying goodbye," the boy whispered. Frank didn't answer. He couldn't. That night, the ranch was quiet except for the wind moving through the pines. He stayed on the porch long after dark, watching shadows shift across the enclosure. The cubs paced restless, sensing change. The smell of autumn hung in the air, sweet, sharp, final. He thought about all the seasons they'd shared, the winter of survival, the spring of growth, the summer of joy. Now fall was here, and it demanded release. Life always did. Inside, the firelight flickered over the open Bible. Frank didn't read the verse this time. He knew it by heart. He just whispered into the stillness. Take care of them wherever they go. Love wasn't ownership. It was stewardship, the willingness to step aside when the time came. Compassion wasn't holding on. It was letting nature finish the work. The next morning, when Mason arrived, the valley was wrapped in fog. Frank was already waiting by the truck. "Ready?" he asked. The boy nodded, though his eyes said otherwise. They loaded the crates, gently covering them with blankets. Maple rumbled low. Rust pressed against the bars, calm but alert. Frank rested his hand on the cage. "You'll know what to do when the door opens," he said softly. "You always have." The drive to the release site was quiet. Trees gave way to higher ridges, the air thinner, colder. As they neared the clearing, Frank felt the lump rise in his throat. He didn't look back at Mason. He just kept driving. When they reached the forest line, the rangers were already waiting. Mist clung to the trees, and somewhere far above, a hawk circled, calling once before disappearing into the clouds. Frank climbed out slowly, his heart heavy but steady. It was time. He didn't yet know that releasing Maple would lead to the hardest choice of his life and the next chapter of redemption. The morning of the release came cold and bright. Fog lifted slowly from the mountains, revealing a stretch of forest so wide it looked endless. Frank parked near the ranger trucks and stepped out. The air smelled of pine and wet soil, the kind of scent that makes a man feel small and forgiven at the same time. 2 state wildlife officers waited by the clearing. They greeted him politely but without smiles, clipboard in hand. One of them, a young woman named Harris, glanced at the cages in the truck bed. "So these are your bears?" she asked. "They're not mine," Frank said softly. "I just kept them alive." Harris nodded, half understanding. "It's good work you've done, but by law, they belong to the state now. We'll guide the release." He knew this part already, but hearing it out loud still stung. Mason stood a few paces back, camera ready, but silent. Frank opened the truck gate. The cubs shifted uneasy. "Give us a minute," he asked. The officers stepped away. He crouched by the cages, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is it. You'll hear the trees before you see them. Just go." The doors lifted. Maple bolted first, one quick burst of motion, a flash of cinnamon fir vanishing into mist. Rust hesitated, turning once toward Frank before following. The woods swallowed them both. The silence afterward was enormous. Even the birds seemed to hold back. Frank stood there, hand on the open cage, not sure if he wanted to cheer or cry. Mason pressed the shutter, capturing the emptiness. Harris returned with the clipboard. "We'll keep track of them by tag. You might get updates from the department." Frank nodded, signing where she pointed. His signature shook slightly. That night the ranch felt wrong. The yard is too quiet, the pen too empty. Frank walked its perimeter anyway, habit more than need. Every creak of the fence made him turn, expecting to see 2 shapes tumbling in the straw. But there was only wind and the steady hum of crickets. He told himself this was the goal, he'd done what was right. Still, it felt like grief. 3 days later, the knock came. Sharp. Official. Frank opened the door to find a uniformed ranger and Harris again, hat in hand. "Mr. Dalton," she began. "We need to talk about the male cub." His heart dropped. "Rust. He hasn't moved far from the release site," she said. "He's staying near the road, rummaging through campsites. It's not uncommon. Sometimes they struggle to adapt." "Is he in danger?" "Not yet, but if he keeps approaching people, we'll have to relocate him, possibly out of state." Frank gripped the doorframe. "He'll learn. He just needs time." Harris sighed. "I'm not here to argue. We just thought you'd want to know." After they left, Frank sat on the porch steps, staring at the tree line. It was the first time he felt powerless since the rescue. He'd given those cubs everything he could: warmth, food, safety. And now the world was reminding him how little control he had. That night, he barely slept. Every noise outside made him sit up, listening for something he couldn't name. Around midnight, he thought he heard a low sound, a familiar rumble near the barn. He grabbed his flashlight, stepped out into the cool air, and followed it. There, by the fence, a shape moved, larger now, but unmistakable. Rust. The bear had come back. Frank froze. The animal lifted its head, eyes catching the light. No fear, no aggression, just recognition. Rust made a soft huffing noise, the same sound he used to make before feeding. Frank lowered the flashlight. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered. Rust pressed against the fence, rumbling deep in his chest. Then slowly, he turned and disappeared into the trees. The next morning, Frank called Dr. Keene. "He came back," he said. Laura didn't sound surprised. "Bears imprint on sound and scent. You were the constant in his world." "He's confused. What do I do?" "Nothing. Don't feed him. Don't speak to him if he returns. If he keeps coming, the authorities will take him. But if he doesn't learn to stay away, they'll see him as a danger." Frank swallowed hard. "So I pretend I don't care?" "You don't pretend," Laura said gently. "You trust that you taught him enough." The days that followed were heavy with waiting. Sometimes Frank would find fresh tracks by the creek or paw marks near the gate, but he never saw Rust again up close. Part of him hoped the bear had found his way deeper into the wilderness. Another part feared the worst. Weeks passed. Autumn faded to early snow. Then, one gray morning, Harris showed up again, this time without her clipboard. "Mr. Dalton, we relocated the mail," she said quietly. "He was scavenging near Missoula. We found him calm, healthy. He's been moved to a monitored reserve in Wyoming." Frank nodded slowly. Relief and sorrow tangled together. "Thank you for telling me." Harris hesitated. "Not everyone would have gone to the trouble you did. Most people would have called the state the moment they found cubs. What made you take them yourself?" He looked past her toward the empty pen. "Because once I didn't." She studied him for a moment, then offered her hand. "You gave them a chance. That's more than most." When she left, Frank walked the fence again. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air. He caught one on his glove and watched it melt. Somewhere out there, two bears were learning what freedom meant. Maybe struggling, thriving, but they were living their own story now. He turned toward the barn, ready to close up for the night, when he noticed Mason standing by the porch. The boy had been quiet for days, camera dangling from his neck. "They moved," Rust, Frank said. "I know," Mason replied. "Rangers told my granddad. He'll be fine." Frank nodded. "Yeah, he will." The boy hesitated. "You ever regret letting them go?" Frank thought about it before answering. "Every day, and not once at the same time." Mason frowned, not understanding. "When you love something wild," Frank said, "you don't measure by how long it stays. You measure by what it becomes after it leaves you." The boy was quiet. Then he lifted the camera and took one last photo, Frank standing beside the empty enclosure, snow drifting around him. "For the record," Mason said softly, "in case they ever come back." That night, the wind returned. Frank sat by the fire, the room lit with soft amber. He wrote in his journal, "Maple released, Rust relocated, both alive." The law took them, but the law didn't raise them. He stared at those words for a long time, then added another line. "Maybe love and law don't always speak the same language, but sometimes they're both trying to protect the same thing." He closed the notebook, leaned back, and listened to the storm outside. It reminded him of that first night, the rain, the cages, the weight of small bodies in his arms. Only now the fear was gone. In its place was a quiet pride that felt almost like peace. Still, some part of him couldn't let go. Each dawn he'd step outside, scanning the tree line. He told himself it was a habit. Maybe hope. Once near sunrise, he saw a hawk glide overhead and thought of Harris's words, "You gave them a chance." He realized then that redemption wasn't a single act. It was maintenance, a discipline, doing the right thing even when no one was there to clap. Weeks later, a letter arrived from the Wyoming Reserve. A photo was tucked inside, Rust standing in open country snow on his muzzle, bigger and surer than Frank remembered. On the back, someone had written, "Healthy, adapting, keeps distance but shows no fear." Frank smiled, eyes damp. "That's my boy," he whispered. He pinned the photo to the wall above the fireplace next to Maple's picture from Mason. Two images. Two worlds, one free, one remembered. Between them hung the verse he'd written years ago on a scrap of paper, the righteous care for the needs of their animals. It struck him how the words had changed meaning again. Once they'd been guilty, then a mission. Now they were simply the truth. He stepped outside, the snow crisp under his boots. The mountains glowed pale in the distance. Somewhere out there, Maple was roaming wild, and Rust was learning a new terrain. Frank imagined them both under the same winter sky, breathing the same cold air. He smiled, pulled his coat tighter, and whispered to the wind, "You did it. You both did." As he turned back toward the cabin, a faint rustle came from the forest edge, soft, fleeting, almost imagined. He paused, listening. Nothing followed but the echo of his own heartbeat. He smiled again. "All right," he said quietly, "if that's how it's going to be." He didn't yet know that what waited in the seasons ahead wasn't silence at all, but the sound of something finding its way home. Winter stretched long that year, the kind that tests every living thing in Montana. Snow piled high along the fence posts, and the creek behind Frank's barn froze into silence. He didn't mind the cold. He'd lived through worse. What got to him was the quiet. No morning paw prints in the mud, no rustle of cubs wrestling in the straw, just wind and his own heartbeat filling the gaps. It had been months since the release. The updates from Wyoming stopped coming after the third letter. Rust had adapted, the ranger said. Strong, independent. That should have been enough. But something in Frank's chest still waited for a sound he couldn't name. Most days he kept busy. Fixed fences, chopped wood, and helped neighbors with feed deliveries. Dr. Keene stopped by now and then to check on him more than his animals. "You don't have to fill every silence," she said once, setting down her thermos on the porch rail. He smiled faintly. Old habits. When you spend years listening for applause, quiet feels like punishment. She nodded. Then, maybe it's time to start hearing it as peace. He liked that thought. But peace didn't come easily. Especially at night, when the valley echoed with distant howls and the memory of bears playing just beyond the porch. One evening, Mason came by, camera slung around his neck. Cheeks red from the cold. "Got accepted," he said, handing Frank a letter. "Wildlife photography program in Bozeman." Frank read the first line aloud, grinning. "They'll be lucky to have you. I wouldn't have applied if not for you," Mason said. "Watching how you took care of them. It made me want to show people what wild looks like when it's left alone." Frank chuckled. "That's the best kind. The kind that doesn't need our help to be beautiful." Mason looked toward the empty pen. "You ever think they might come back?" Frank shrugged. "Animals remember what's worth remembering. Maybe someday if the wind's right." The boy smiled, then raised his camera. One more photo for the end of the story. Frank stood still while the shutter clicked. After Mason left for school that spring, the ranch grew quieter still. The thaw came slowly, turning snow to streams that ran through the pasture. The smell of wet pine filled the air again. Life was returning, but it felt like it belonged to someone else. Then, one morning in May, Frank woke to a sound he hadn't heard in a long time. A low, distant call rolling through the valley. It wasn't a wolf or elk. It was deeper, slower, almost like a memory pulling itself out of sleep. He stepped onto the porch, heart hammering. The sound came again, carried on the wind. "Rust," he whispered. It didn't come again, but he stood there until the sun rose, fully scanning the tree line. The logical part of him said it was impossible. The rest of him didn't care. That day, for the first time in months, he opened the old notebook. On a fresh page, he wrote, "If it were him, he's grown strong enough to be heard again." Days passed without another call, but something inside Frank had shifted. He started walking the trails again, the ones he used to take when feeding the cubs. He left nothing behind, no food, no bait, just footprints and quiet hope. Wildlife has a way of leaving signs for those who pay attention. In late June, he found one. A half-turned rock near the creek, claw marks deep in the bark of a fallen tree. Not fresh, but not old either. Grizzly marks. Frank crouched, tracing the lines with a gloved hand. "You're still out there," he murmured. He didn't tell anyone. Not Laura, not Mason. Some things were better left as private truths. By midsummer, the valley was alive again. Elk in the meadows, coyotes near the ridge. Frank kept to his chores, but at night he'd sit by the fire and listen. He'd close his eyes and swear he could hear faint sounds drifting from the woods. Footsteps too heavy for deer, slow and deliberate. He never saw anything. Maybe that was mercy. Dr. Keene visited one evening in July, dropping off supplies. "You look better," she said, eyeing the color back in his face. "Been walking more," Frank replied. "Helps with the knees, helps with the thinking too." She smiled. "You know I've been meaning to tell you something. The sanctuary in Helena's expanding. They're looking for advisors, people with experience handling rescues. You'd be perfect." He laughed softly. "I'm too old for paperwork. They don't need paperwork. They need patience, and you've got that in spades." He didn't answer right away. He looked toward the forest where twilight was painting everything gold. Maybe he said finally, "If they'll let me teach the part that matters, how not to lose yourself in saving things." Laura smiled. That's exactly what they need. When she left, Frank stood by the fence thinking. Maybe the valley didn't need to stay silent. Maybe healing wasn't just surviving loss, it was using what it taught you. That fall, he accepted the offer. A few days a week, he'd drive to the Helena Wildlife Sanctuary, teaching volunteers how to handle orphaned animals, how to build trust without taking it. He'd talk about diet space routine, but mostly about restraint. The goal, he told them, isn't to tame. It's to remind them what they already know. The younger workers loved his stories, the rescue, the storm, the cubs. One girl asked him once, "Do you ever miss them?" He smiled. "Every day. But that's how I know it mattered." Evenings, he'd drive back through the valley as the sun sank behind the ridges. Some days, he'd think he saw movement among the trees, a shape keeping pace with the truck just far enough away to make him wonder. He'd roll down the window, breathe the cool air, and whisper, "Keep going." It was on one of those evenings near the end of October that something unexpected happened. As he passed the old trailhead near the creek, he noticed the fence post there had been knocked loose. Not by weather, the marks were too deliberate. He stopped. The truck stepped out and walked over. Mud fur caught on the wire paw prints, pressed deep into the earth. Big. Adult. He followed them a few yards into the woods until the trees closed around him. The prints led to a clearing he knew well, the same one where the circus cages had stood years ago. The place where it all began. The air smelled of rain and pine, the kind of stillness that holds breath. Then, from across the clearing movement, a large bear stepping from the brush coat thick and shining in the dim light. It paused, watching him. Frank didn't move. "Maple," he said softly. The bear blinked, head tilting. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she made a sound, a low rolling huff he remembered from the cub years. Not fear, not warning. Recognition. Behind her, smaller shapes emerged, two cubs tumbling over roots, curious alive. Frank's throat closed. "Well," he whispered, "looks like you did all right." He stayed where he was, hands at his sides, not reaching, not intruding. Maple stood for another few seconds, then nudged her cubs gently toward the trees. Before disappearing, she looked back once, eyes catching the last light of dusk. Frank exhaled, slowly shaking. "Good girl," he said. He walked back to the truck under the first stars, the valley around him humming with night sounds. It felt like a conversation he hadn't known he was waiting to finish. Back at the ranch, he wrote one line in his notebook. "Some echoes don't fade, they just come back with cubs of their own." Over the next weeks, he saw her twice more, never close, never long. Each time the cubs were bolder. He never told anyone, not even Laura. It was enough to know that what he'd given had multiplied. One crisp morning, Mason returned from school for the holidays. "Heard you're working with the sanctuary now," he said, setting down his gear bag. "You finally took your own advice." Frank smiled. "Couldn't let the young folks handle all the hard lessons." Mason laughed, then showed him a photo he'd taken in Yellowstone, a mother bear leading two cubs along the ridge. "Saw them last week," he said. "Made me think of Maple and Rust." Frank studied the picture. The landscape looked familiar. "Maybe it's not just a memory," he said quietly. The boy smiled. "You really think it could be them?" Frank folded the picture carefully and slipped it into his Bible. "I think the world has funny ways of saying thank you." That evening, as dusk fell and the first snowflakes drifted down, Frank stepped onto the porch. The air was sharp, but alive. From somewhere deep in the woods came a distant sound. A bear's call, low and steady, rolling through the valley like an answer. He didn't go looking this time. He just listened. As the echo faded into the night, Frank whispered, "We're all still here." He turned back toward the cabin where the light from the stove flickered softly through the window. The sound of that call lingered long after the silence returned, a reminder that what's once healed keeps healing. He didn't yet know that the next winter would bring the valley's loudest echo of all, and the miracle waiting in its wake. Winter came quietly that year. The first snow didn't fall. It drifted slow and soundless, blanketing the valley in stillness. Frank felt it before he saw it, the way the world holds its breath when something sacred is about to happen. He'd turned 70 by then. His days had grown simpler early mornings at the Wildlife Sanctuary in Helena, teaching volunteers, feeding orphaned fox kits, helping with release protocols. Evenings he returned to the ranch, the one place that still smelled of memory, wood smoke pine and faint traces of the bears he'd once raised. His body moved more slowly now, but his hands were steady. Arthritis had claimed his knuckles, not his resolve. He still kept the same Bible by the fire, the same journal, the same photograph of Rust standing proud under a Wyoming sky. Most nights he read until the fire burned low, then stepped out to breathe the cold. He liked how the snow muted everything the world, smaller, closer. He often imagined Maple somewhere out there, her cubs grown roaming the ridges, doing what wild things were meant to do. Then one night in December he heard it again. That low, distant rumble rolling across the valley. It wasn't imagination this time. It was closer. He opened the door, stepping into the cold. The moon hung full above the ridge, silver light spilling across the pasture. The sound came again, steady, familiar, like the deep hum of a heart too big for silence. He whispered her name without meaning to. Maple. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then from the tree line, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. Big, slow, purposeful. She stopped 20 yards from the porch, steam rising from her breath. Even under moonlight, Frank knew that face, the scar across her right shoulder from the old circus wound, the way she stood slightly angled, watchful but calm. His throat tightened. You came back. She didn't move. Her eyes, golden and unblinking, caught his and held them. Behind her faint rustling, the smaller shapes of two cubs nosing through the snow, curious, clumsy. Frank gripped the porch rail to steady himself. He wanted to step forward, but he knew better. This wasn't a reunion. It was an understanding. The space between them was the proof of everything he'd done right. Maple lowered her head slightly, an almost human motion, and made a soft chuffing sound, the same noise she'd made as a cub when she was content. Then she turned her head, nudging her cubs forward. They followed her lead, unafraid, exploring the edges of the yard. Frank watched, barely breathing. The sight broke him open and healed him all at once. He whispered, "Welcome home." For the next few minutes, he simply stood there, letting the silence wrap around them. The cubs tumbled in the snow, small bursts of energy against the pale light. Maple stayed near the fence, calm and alert, eyes always on them, and sometimes on him. Then, from inside the barn, a soft sound, a door creak, maybe wind, maybe instinct. Maple froze, lifted her head, and gave a low growl. The cubs immediately gathered to her side. Frank raised his hands gently. "It's all right. You're safe here." She held his gaze for another heartbeat, then turned, leading her cubs back toward the trees. Before vanishing, she stopped once more at the edge of the light and made a short, low sound, a farewell or a promise. Frank couldn't tell which. When the forest swallowed them, the night felt vast again. He exhaled shakily, the cold air catching in his lungs. Inside, he sat by the fire, heart still racing. He wrote in his journal, "Maple returned. 2 cubs, healthy, calm, wild. God, I don't deserve this grace." The next morning, he told no one. Some stories were meant to stay quiet until they ripened. But he couldn't help leaving a bowl of water by the fence that night, though he knew she didn't need it. Over the next week, signs appeared. Tracks near the creek, claw marks on an old birch. Twice he found the water bowl tipped over and paw prints circling the barn. She was visiting, but only in her own time. Dr. Keene came by one afternoon with a batch of medicine for a fox kit. "You've been smiling more lately," she said, narrowing her eyes. "You hiding something from me?" Frank just laughed. "Maybe I finally decided to take your advice." She raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "The one about peace." Laura smiled. Good. Took you long enough. That night, Frank sat outside as the sun went down, waiting without waiting. The air was clear, the sky sharp with stars. Just before midnight, movement near the fence caught his eye. Maple again, this time alone. She moved more slowly, deliberately. Older like him. He spoke softly. "You still checking on me, girl?" She made that same quiet chuffing noise, the sound of acknowledgement, then settled on her haunches near the fence line. Frank sat on the porch steps only a few yards away. For a while, neither moved. The night was theirs alone. He thought about everything that had led to this moment, the storm years ago, the cages, the rescue, the law, the silence afterward. He realized Maple's return wasn't a miracle. It was a full circle, closing quietly in the dark. "You saved me too, you know," he said. "Back then I thought I was rescuing you, but I think we were just trading mercy." The bear blinked as if listening. Then she rose, turned toward the forest, and vanished once more. He didn't see her again for weeks. Snow-deepened temperatures dropped. Each morning, Frank checked the fence line, the creek bed, hoping for signs, but finding only wind-carved drifts. Still, he believed she was out there. In February, a storm hit hard, heavy snow wind howling through the valley. Frank stayed inside the power-flickering fire, burning low. Late that night, he heard a sound outside, faint at first, then unmistakable. Scratching, then a low, urgent rumble. He opened the door to find Maple at the fence, half covered in snow, eyes bright. Behind her, one of her cubs stumbled weak. Without thinking, Frank grabbed his coat flashlight and walked toward them. The cub had a wound on its leg, deep, likely from a trap or a fall. Maple stood back uneasy, watching every move. "It's all right," Frank said softly, kneeling in the snow. "I'll help." He worked slowly, using his scarf to bind the wound hand steady despite the cold. The cub didn't resist, only whimpered once. Maple stayed close but didn't interfere. When he finished, he stepped back, giving her space. She moved forward, sniffed the cub's leg, then looked up at him. Their eyes met no fear, just understanding. Then she nudged the cub, and together they disappeared into the trees again. Frank stood there long after they'd gone, snow piling on his shoulders. Heart full, he knew she wouldn't have come if she hadn't trusted him still. That single act, a mother letting a man near her cub, was worth every year of silence. The next day, he found a single paw print near the porch, larger than the rest, pressed deep into the snow. A mark of thanks or goodbye. He didn't touch it, just let the wind fill it naturally. In the weeks that followed, the valley seemed to breathe easier. Birds returned early. The creek thawed faster. Frank went about his routines lighter somehow, as if carrying less of the world on his back. When spring arrived, he received a letter from Mason, now working for National Geographic, traveling across Alaska. Enclosed was a photograph, a female grizzly with 2 young cubs walking along a ridge, the mountains behind them glowing with sunset. The note read, "Saw this outside glacier. Thought of you. Maybe some stories don't really end." Frank smiled. He pinned the photo next to the old ones of Rust and the Sanctuary crew, 3 generations of bears, each free in their own way. That evening, as the last snow melted into the soil, he walked down to the fence one final time. The grass was new. The air smelled like rain. He whispered into the quiet, "You did good, Maple. You kept your promise." That night taught him something simple: love doesn't need to last forever to stay alive. Sometimes it returns in paw prints and echoes, reminding you that kindness leaves its own trail through time. As he turned back toward the cabin, the sound of rushing water filled the valley's snowmelt, feeding the creek life starting over again. Frank smiled, feeling both small and infinite. He didn't yet know that his story too was circling toward its own return, and that Maple's echo would carry further than either of them could imagine. Spring came early that year. The creek ran louder than usual, fed by snow melt tumbling down from the bitter roots. Frank's ranch woke slowly, the horses pawing at new grass, the chickens testing sunlight after a long winter. He moved through each day steadily and deliberately, as if time itself had finally decided to walk at his pace. He was 71 now, and the sanctuary in Helena had become part of his rhythm. Twice a week he made the drive down Highway 12, truck full of feed and medicine. The volunteers called him Mr. Dalton, though he kept reminding them it was just Frank. He spent his mornings teaching them to move quietly to earn trust through patience. When new handlers rushed, he'd stop them with a raised hand and say, "Don't make the wild fit your timing. Make your timing fit the wild." They listened, because when Frank spoke, it was never a lecture, it was lived truth. He taught by doing. Fixing enclosures, cleaning troughs, sitting beside wounded raccoons, foxes, and even a mountain lion cub too weak to stand. People often said he had a gift, but he didn't believe in that word. What he had was time, and he gave it freely. Dr. Keene once told him, "You realize you've built what you always dreamed of. This place, this is your sanctuary." Frank smiled. "I didn't build it. I just showed up long enough for it to exist." That was how he saw it, redemption by repetition. Not one grand act, but a lifetime of smaller ones. Gentle hands doing quiet work. Evenings were for the ranch. He'd feed the horses, light the fire, and sit with his journal. Most entries were short, plain observations, 2 orphaned foxes released. Mason's article was published in Nat Geo. Found bear tracks near the creek again. But every so often he'd write something that felt like a prayer. Patience grows slower than regret, but it lasts longer. Mason visited in late May. He'd changed older, tanned from travel, carrying stories in his eyes. "They ran your story," he said, handing Frank a magazine. Across the center spread was a photo of the ranch and sanctuary's staff title above it, "The Hands That Healed the Wild." Frank laughed quietly. "They make it sound prettier than it was." "It is pretty," Mason said. "People need that. Hope's got to look like something." They walked the fence line after dinner. The air smelled like pine and thawed earth. Mason took photos while Frank pointed out fresh tracks, deer, fox, maybe bear. "You think Maple's still out there?" Mason asked. "I don't think," Frank said softly. "I know." The boy smiled. "Then maybe she's watching over you now." Frank chuckled. "More likely she's laughing at me for getting slower." But that night, when the moon rose and the valley filled with light, he thought about what Mason said. Maybe the animals we save never really leave. Maybe their trust lingers in the air like scent, reminding the world that kindness leaves a trace too. He woke early the next morning, as always, but his steps were slower. The years had been kind, but they'd taken their toll. His breath came shorter, climbing the hill behind the barn, and his joints ached from the chill. Still, he worked, because work, he said, was the only prayer worth repeating. By summer, the sanctuary had expanded. A new rehabilitation wing bore a small brass plaque in honor of Frank Dalton, whose quiet hands changed loud hearts. He hadn't asked for it. Laura and Mason insisted. He stood in front of it once, shaking his head. "If they only knew how stubborn I was getting here." "They do," Laura said. "That's why they put your name on it." The following winter was harder. Frank caught pneumonia, spent 2 weeks in recovery, then went right back to work. "I'll rest when the snow melts," he told Laura. She rolled her eyes, but she knew better than to argue. In February, a storm swept through the valley's snow, thick and heavy wind shaking the cabin windows. Frank sat by the fire, bundled in his blanket, writing slower, now the words uneven but deliberate. "If I'm lucky, I'll see one more spring. If not, this winter will do. Everything I wanted came back home, eventually." That night near midnight, the horses stirred. He heard them through the walls, snorts the sound of hooves in snow. He rose stiff but alert and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to sting, but he barely felt it. The yard glowed silver under the moon, and there by the fence stood Maple. Alone this time. Her coat is thick, her body strong, her eyes calm as ever. She didn't move toward him. She didn't need to. Frank smiled. "You made it through another winter." She gave that same soft chuff, the sound that once meant contentment, and lowered her head slightly. For a moment, it felt like the world itself paused between them. No fear, No boundaries, only recognition. He whispered, "Thank you for coming back." Then, as quietly as she'd arrived, Maple turned toward her shape fading into the white. Frank stayed there long after she disappeared as snow gathering on his shoulders. When he finally went inside, he sat by the fire and wrote his last entry. "Love heals all wounds, even the wild ones." Maybe that's what we're here to do. Leave the world softer than we found it. He passed peacefully that night, sitting in his chair, hands folded, the fire still burning low. When morning came, the sanctuary team found him there, a faint smile still on his face. Laura was the one who noticed the paw prints outside one set of large prints near the porch, fresh in the snow. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Mason handled the rest. He arranged for Frank's ashes to be spread along the creek behind the ranch, the same place where the Cubs had once played. At the small service, he read aloud from Frank's journal. "Gentle hands are stronger than they look. They carry what time forgets." A few weeks later, Mason published an article online titled "The Legacy of Gentle Hands." It told Frank's story not as tragedy or miracle, but as a quiet lesson that compassion is endurance, not emotion. That wildlife rescue isn't about saving lives, but about giving them back to themselves. The piece went viral. Viewers around the world shared it. Teachers, park rangers, parents, kids. Donations poured into the sanctuary. A year later, the organization expanded again, officially renamed as the Dalton Wildlife Sanctuary. A wooden sign at the entrance carried Frank's favorite line, "The righteous care for the needs of their animals." Mason became its director at 29. Laura stayed on as head vet. Together, they trained a new generation of rescuers, people who learned to speak softly, move slowly, and work without applause. Every spring, Mason would find himself walking the same fence Frank once did, checking the boundaries at dawn. Sometimes, when the wind carried down from the mountains, he swore he could hear faint sounds from the forest, an echo of something large moving through snow. The deep hum of life continuing. He'd look toward the ridge and smile. "Still watching over us, huh?" Some legacies roar, others whisper. Frank's was the quiet kind, measured not by noise, but by the lives that kept breathing because he'd chosen to care. His story became a reminder that gentleness is not weakness, and that one person's compassion can ripple farther than they'll ever know. If you were standing in that valley today, you might still see signs of his work, paw prints by the creek. New enclosures filled with recovering forest animals. Volunteers learning patience the way he taught it, through presence, not pressure. You might even hear in the distance the echo of a bear's low call rolling through the pines, the same way it once reached Frank. That sound isn't just wildlife, it's memory. It's proof that kindness once planted keeps growing long after we're gone. The world doesn't change because of grand gestures. It changes when ordinary people show up for small things again and again until mercy becomes habit. That's the quiet revolution of compassion. If you've stayed with this story to the end, take a moment before you scroll away. Think about the small, wild things in your own life, the people, the causes, the moments that ask for your gentle hands. You don't have to rescue a bear cub to make a difference. You just have to care enough to start. If this story reminded you that empathy still matters, tap the like button to help it reach someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that compassion deserves a home in this world, subscribe, stay close, and keep walking with us through the stories of the wild. Because healing like love begins when someone decides to listen.